More than 10 years ago, I made my first electronic trade uh, on in stock trading on my computer at home. I'd never done that before. I was involved in the real estate development in the Twin Cities market for several decades, and that's what I did as an occupation. But the banks stopped funding small developers for uh, small projects in late 2006. And so I found myself looking for something else that I could do going into retirement. And I'm still not retired. But I made my first trade then, and I was very inconsistent. I would, uh, be profitable on one trade, and then not be profitable, and then I'd really concentrate on what I was doing and 3 times I'd be profitable and think I was doing it exactly right the fourth time, and lose money the fourth time. There was no consistency. So I knew that if I was going to do something as far as stock trading was concerned, I had to be consistent. Otherwise, there was no point in losing money, especially when you're going or getting closer to retirement. I thought that I would trade stocks and find a system to copy or enhance or do something along those lines. And yet I knew, and I asked the question often, what's more important, the next trade that you make or the system that you use to find the trade that you're going to make? And obviously the system is more important. And that's a personal trap that I fell into, thinking that I could risk funds and trade, knowing that I was missing the most important part of this process. And how we look at traps that we're in is a very interesting study in itself. But I was guilty of that, and I've tried to make others aware of traps that they might be in, and thinking that they even have a system when they really don't have a system. Because it's easy to, maintain the status quo, or don't bother me, I'm trading, or whatever excuse you might think of. But definitely the system is more important. And so I knew I needed a system. I just didn't know how I was going to get it. For literally more than 5 years, that process went on. Probably 6 years that process went on, until we discovered some interesting things about methods and procedures and systems. And it was at that point when, I was just about ready to call it quits because I couldn't figure it out. But the idea, or the one of the key ideas that we decided that we had to have was the ability to analyze whatever these indicators were that we were creating, and know what was going to happen with the market in a higher percentage of times that we traded. So in other words, we wanted to be dealing with leading indicators that would tell us what's going to happen the next day. That's literally a brief description of what we were looking for. Most will tell you that you can't do that. And yet most think we're crazy when they first hear us say that we find gaps before the gap occurs. The system that you have is the single most important thing about your trading that you will ever get involved with. your decision to use what you're using or to break away and examine something that is foreign to you or different from what you're now doing is a big step. But I really encourage you to try this system out. There's a 14-day free trial, if nothing else. But you should really see the power of it, and you're likely to do that in the 14 days that you examine the system in this free trial. I knew that I needed the system that I would create. I knew that it had to have the ability to see those changes, those future changes in the price direction of the stock. You can call it leading indicators, you can call it what you will, but today we have two abilities to identify strength in a market movement. And those two methods are through indicator line length and divergence. The strength, if you're not familiar with it, Day Trading Visual Basics was designed as a reversal recognition identification system. We literally pick the tops and pick the bottoms of high cycles and low cycles. In doing that, we recognize that that normally when a cycle changed, was going down and it changed and started going back up, that cycle moved slowly or moderately up. There was nothing quick about it. But we also knew that there were quick turnarounds. One, you'd get a turnaround, you'd have a giant green candle going up. So we needed to be able to pick those days with strength. And that's how everything after that evolved, was with the idea that we had to identify strength. Real basic example is a BOC pattern. It's a V-shaped pattern. It's the bottom of a cycle pattern, and it goes down, and then the next day it goes up, forming a V. When the right leg is higher than the left leg, you have a BOC higher pattern, and when the right leg is lower than the left leg, you have a BOC lower pattern in an indicator line. When it's lower, it's weaker. And so you're looking for longer line length on the right side or the right leg of a BOC pattern. The other way is that zip red can move 30, 40, 60, 80, 90 points in one day, and it only can move 100 total. Many times I've seen it under 10 and go above 90. And the price would move but a few cents, and you know what's going to happen the following day. Or at least subject to some conditions, you know what's going to happen the following day. Those are a couple of examples of indicator line length. Divergence has just a variety of ways to determine divergence. You can do it through line divergence, like one line, like zip red is up and zip gray is down. We spent a fair amount of time synchronizing and matching lines together as pairs and making sure that we could recognize tiny market force pressures that would change based on the movement of those lines. If you take the default indicators that are on TradeStation, you're not going to get anywhere near the amount of divergence from those indicators that you'll see on the indicators that we have. There's 22 MFR, market force recognition indicators. Except for Zip Green and Zip Zion, all of the other indicators are tracking a market pressure or a market force within the system. And it's those sensitive indicators that create the strength of the system. Because we talk about the three powers of the system: the indicator power, the formula power, and the procedures power. The procedures power is the daily analysis that you make between indicators and the anticipated price movement that takes place based on which direction the indicators are going, which location the indicators are in, and other aspects of how two indicators might be used together or more. But in any case, you are looking at comparisons. You're doing comparative analysis on what's happening, and through this process, this daily process, and this idea, this procedures analysis, is not exclusive to day trading visual basics. But we knew we had to have this procedure, or we definitely had to have some kind of method like this, that we wanted to look at the market, examine the market, see what it was doing, identify where it was going and why. That aspect had to be within the system that was created. That's not true with other systems. There's a lot of people out there that want to tell you their algorithm is the best around, and if you just put your faith and trust in us, you can make money. And those are blind faith methods. And and then they say they work 75% of the time or something like that. And that wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to see why and how the market was moving, and if it was going to move in the direction that I anticipated, and then with the strength issues, identify which ones were good indicator or good stocks to get into based on the strength that we identified. And so the indicators that we ended up using then created patterns. And those patterns are just an arrangement of 1, 2, 3, 4 indicators in a group or in a shape that alerted us to a pattern. And then we took conditions. Think of it like taking 10 patterns, and when you examine those 10 patterns, you have 2 of them that are 2 nice big green candles the next day, and 5 or 6 are small green candles, and 2 or 3 are little red candles. And so 2 out of 10, or 20% of the time, we got a really nice green candle with that pattern. So there were specific conditions that we called good conditions that would generate nice green candles the day after that pattern appeared, if it had the proper conditions with it. And so that became the formula that we established in identifying with the trades that we made. The beautiful part about this that we didn't realize initially is that when we grabbed the conditions of those 2, we were grabbing 100% of the good conditions. And then when I tell you that our high probability ratios are always above 90%, most of the time above 95%, people just say, well, that can't be. But it is, because we only use those good conditions. And so we pick a pattern, we verify the conditions, and then we use a signal to identify when to enter, and we also use signals on when to exit a trade. There's a lot of profit lost at that point, either entering or exiting a trade. And as a result of using patterns, conditions, and signals, this formula that we use became the basis of high probability trading. We only do patterns with good conditions, thereby creating high probability opportunities. I mean, it's like a self-perpetuating situation. The amazing part of this whole thing is that the better your conditions are, the more likelihood you have additional or stronger movements. Give you a few examples. The next day, when I say next day, I mean one day. When I say uptrend, I mean 2, 3, 4 days. Multiple day movement when I say uptrend. So you can be looking for a next day up, or you can be looking for an uptrend, or you can be looking for a gap up. But what it amounts to is that you've got conditions, and the better your conditions are, or the more conditions that you have, the greater and stronger the movement. And so, for example, when you're searching for a gap, excuse me, when you're searching for a gap, there are 3 patterns that you have to go to find gaps up, and the same is true with gaps down. And those 3 are the identical indicators and the down. We're talking about up touch or gaps up at the moment. Those are identical indicators and down touches in the trend chart and proximity group patterns. And there's 2 methods in the proximity group patterns. It's by location and by shapes, like a BOC pattern or a right leg W pattern or a high M pattern or a TOC, top of cycle pattern, bottlenose patterns. Those are shape patterns. And then location, the proximity group is on the power chart. And so the power 4 is the pink, blue, white, and yellow lines. The power 5 adds the Zion line to it. And so when you have when you have, for example, the power 4 above the power orange and power Zion under the power orange, that is a divergent condition, and it is one of the primary location patterns that generates gaps up. Gaps down have the same identical indicators, the same down touches, except they are up touches now, and the same proximity group, location, and shape patterns that are typical for down touches, are typical for gaps down. And so these patterns are, now we have 3 types of conditions. For example, when you have we have a pattern referred to as a red spike. It's zip red down and under 50 and zip yellow down and above 50. When that occurs, there's a high percentage of time that it will be a reversal and go up the next day. That is a red spike. Now there's a lot of flexibility in that because the yellow can be under 35 even, and it'll still work. But I'm not going to get into the flexibilities of that particular pattern at this point. What I'm trying to say is that there's a pattern there that we see that is not part of the identical indicators. In the identical indicator qualifications, you have at least 12 out of the 22 market force recognition indicators that need to be in an identical pattern, like a BOC pattern or a TOC pattern. You got to have a majority, 12 out of the 22. You can have 2 pattern groups, like a BOC pattern and a right leg W pattern. And you could have 9 in one and 6 in the other. Now you got 15 identical patterns in a 2 pattern group. And that qualifies as the basic criteria for a gap up in the identical indicators pattern qualification. You have to have the identical indicators, you have to have the down touches in the trend chart, and you have to have proximity, location, and shape patterns that are relatively normal. There's a give and take in the proximity, location, and shape patterns, but typically you're going to find, which often occurs, is that a particular pattern is going to have the location of the indicators in generally 3 or 4 different areas that will qualify it as a gap up. And after you study that pattern, you begin to realize that the indicators are in a specific location and oftentimes in a particular shape to cause them to go to gap up. When you add to that, for example, when you have that BOC pattern, those 9 BOC patterns and those 6 right leg W patterns, you add to that a red spike telling you that next day it's going to go up. You have an added pattern to the situation. Well, what you also have is there's only 22 lines to look at. And if you've got 15 in the 2 identical indicators, and now you've got another 1 or 2 lines, actually, the zip red and zip yellow, based on the red spike, you now have 2 more lines out of the 22 that are adding to the supporting evidence. There's 3 types of conditions. You have the conditions that make up the requirements for the pattern, like excuse me, like when I said zip red is down and under 50. The condition of that pattern is that it had a qualification aspect of it of being down. You could argue that it also has to be under 50, but the condition of that line is going down, and that's a requirement that describes the pattern or defines the pattern. Because if you had zip red above 50 going up and zip yellow under 50 going up, you now have a red peak. And that pattern reverses back down the next day. So in this case, the direction establishes the requirement describing the pattern. So number 1, you have conditions that are requirements. Number 2, you have conditions that are good. You can say poor or bad and good. And when they're good for that specific pattern, you then have a pattern that has an extremely high probability ratio in moving in the direction that you anticipate and with significant strength. Because why? Because you know it's going to be with significant strength because you've identified the conditions that gave you those 2 nice green candles originally out of those 10 patterns that you looked at. And so obviously everything is in degrees of a push. And so you can identify with certain movements or certain situations and not get the exact same thing, but you're going to get something that's very similar. And at that point, then you're just going to, as you're trading during the day, you're just going to use your 2 or 3 minute interval on a master platform chart, and you can pick the top or pick the bottom of what you're trading. And so this process that we use in using the patterns, using the conditions, and using the signals, and then that whole thing carries through into what I've been describing in the gaps. When the third type of condition is what we refer to as extra conditions or supporting evidence. That red spike that I talked about as an additional pattern in the equation that we had, where we had 9 BOC patterns and 6 right leg W patterns, that the red spike was another whole pattern that pointed in the up direction. And you can also have indicator lines that point in the up direction, like zip red and swing pink are your 2 fastest or quickest lines in the system. Zip pink moves probably even faster than zip red. Swing pink, I meant to say, I think. Swing pink moves faster than zip red, or should I say often can change faster than zip red, but swing pink does not have the line length movement like zip red does. Zip red will move 60, 70, 80 points. There's obviously different numerical scales in the other charts, but it just still doesn't move like zip red moves. So this situation that we have inside of this system is a simple process of adding more information. The more supporting evidence that you get, the stronger your gap is going to be, or the stronger your movement is going to be. You can find indicators, you can find 15 or 18 identical indicators and not find a gap and not find a down touch. That next day is not going to gap. But because you got 18 identical indicators, you can get a really nice candle the next day or the start of an uptrend. So it's just a matter of the more evidence that you see, you end up understanding or identifying with strong movements. Because what are we looking for? We're looking for strength. And you can find it in the indicator line lengths, you can find it in divergence, and you can find it in the way you're analyzing those opportunities through the indicators. Because candles won't tell you much at all. I mean, even the pros will, they use candles quite a bit. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But they're so much more powerful if you can use sensitive indicator lines rather than candles on 5-minute charts. So there's a lot to the system. There's a lot of ability within the system, because you can talk about the patterns, the conditions, and the signals. You can talk about the high probability that it creates. You can talk about the formula that you use, the searches that you have. What's even an additional benefit to the entire system is we have master radar screen alerts, box color alerts that will show you every single possible down touch. The trend red, green, and gray are the fast lines, and they down touch the trend trio, which is the pink, blue, and yellow lines. They also can touch the zero, they can touch underneath the zero, and the sixth one is referred to as a sky touch. And those are the 6 possible down touches that occur that will cause a gap up. You have to have one of those in the downtrend, in the downtrend chart. In the trend chart. You have to have a downtrend qualifying movement, and then in theory you have a gap up, and you can have those gaps up with the basic qualifying requirements of those 3 patterns. If you add a red spike to it, it just magnifies the gap. It just gives it more power, and you can literally see big gaps based on additional patterns. Or sometimes you'll have 3 or 4, even 5 divergent pairs. Pink and blue are one's up, one's down. You can have pair divergence as well. And whenever you have this one, you always get a decent gap. And that's with pink and blue up and white and yellow down. or vice versa. The idea is that they're pairs. Normally it works best when pink and blue are down and white and yellow are up. Then you get a nice gap up. So you can talk about pair divergence, you can talk about pattern divergence, you can talk about line divergence. There's just several different methods that you can look at in the way of divergence. You can also talk about opposite indicators. Like one of my best and my favorite divergent conditions is when trend red is up and power red is down, or vice versa. You've got two indicators on two different charts that are in opposite movement. And those are powerful because trend red, power red, and swing Zion are your big three. And they, for some reason, they reflect power within the system in a combination that is very effective. When all three of those are in the same pattern, like they're all low, and they're in maybe a low angle down, or they're in a BOC pattern at the bottom, they're all three lowest, you get a really strong movement up. Typically those go for a few days. So lots of ammunition there that I've identified in how the system works. My intention was to give you an overview of what's happening in the system. There's really a lot more to it than that. There's more information I could give you is what I'm saying. I just covered the highlights of how this system works and why it works so effectively. But it truly is powerful. So I encourage you to make a decision about what system you want to use, because that system is going to be the method that you pick to find your next opportunity. And we find only high probability trades based on the formula that we use. So if you'll follow the basic procedures outlined within the system, your ability to magnify your results is very strong. So have fun trading. Enjoy what you're doing. When I was losing money back in 2007, having a profitable trade and then losing money on the next one, it wasn't fun. And so I'm encouraging you. It's just like when we discovered those patterns. I mean, for a long time we only had less than a dozen, maybe 8 to 10 or 12, and then that grew into we ended up with 23 patterns in each group that we have here today. And we're working on a couple of others, but for now we have 23. 23 different patterns types up and 23 different pattern types down. So a lot to choose from, hundreds of opportunities that you can make every day. There's probably, I don't know what the ratios are for sure, but I'm guessing that somewhere in the vicinity of 20 or 30 or 40% of the movement in all of the 20,000 stocks that are being traded each day, you will be able to identify strength. Some days it's going to be 10%. Other days it might be 50%. But generally speaking, there's going to be, 2 or 3, maybe 4 out of every 10 stocks that you, with the use of these indicators, you'll be able to identify strength in them. It just really depends on the day. So that's it for this video.